So let me introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Professor Eric Friginal, who is newly appointed head of the Department of English and Communication at PolyU. Before coming to Hong Kong, Eric was professor and director of international studies at Georgia State University in the US. His main research areas include corpus linguistics, quantitative research, language policy and planning, technology and language teaching, social linguistics, cross-cultural communication, discipline-specific writing, and the analysis of spoken professional discourse in the workplace. So a variety of very interesting research areas. And Eric is also co-editor of the Applied Corpus Linguistics journal. So a warm welcome to you, Eric, and over to you for our first talk this afternoon, which is about re-envisioning communication in post-COVID academia.
Thank you so much, Hans. I'm so honored that you gave the introduction for this talk this afternoon. Thank you. And hi again, everybody. Hope you all had an amazing lunch. And thank you all for, again, joining us during this talk. Across the world, talking across the world symposium. As Hans mentioned, I am envisioning US academia as a workplace in this presentation. And I'm looking at how we have worked on communication practices in higher education. Obviously, I'm going to be focusing, at least in this talk, in the US setting, with context for instruction, how people negotiated assessment, and also research. And as we know, and especially what we heard this morning, amazing talk from our panel and also from Jane, how COVID and the pandemic dramatically changed everything that we have been doing. And we needed to rework, restudy, and work on further analyzing what we're doing with the current practices that in the past 2 years changed our ways. I have been mentioned as an optimist. Maybe I am, and maybe hopelessly so. In terms of looking at the background for my study, I actually picked on the good stuff, thinking about how higher education in the United States, and I have this quote as what I added, successfully navigated communicative changes with relative ease. And this was a quote from Inside Higher Ed, an online publication based primarily in the United States, from Francisco in 2021. And, I thought to myself when I saw this and problematized it, is this true? Is this really, like, are we successful? Have we worked on really successfully navigating communication and procedures and processes in academia in the United States? But if you look further, a lot of these studies are actually looking at, well, we did not mess up, in terms of, like, COVID happened, but we were able to continue. We did not stop. Students graduated, faculty board meetings and faculty meetings in general, and PhD dissertation proposals and defenses happened. And in fact, some of them worked well, so it's more looking at, we did not dramatically stop what we were doing during face-to-face periods or pre-COVID. So fully online and hybrid instruction, virtual faculty meetings, online assessment have allowed us, and at least in this context, those of us in the US, to align relatively well with our calendars, with our schedules, with only minor disruption. So that's one indication of success. And that's, in a way, how communication was still facilitated in this process. As Hans mentioned, and this is going to be at least the perspective of my presentation, because I'm looking at experiential and personal sharing here in terms of what I experienced and what we had. I worked at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia in the US for close to 13 years, and been there, enjoyed the time there, enjoyed the city of Atlanta. I was in the Department of Applied Linguistics and ESL, a department that is very much prepared when it comes to options for technology and language teaching. and also for internationalization, and a lot of other programs related to international students. So there is that background. Georgia State is in the southeastern United States. For some of you who are familiar with politics in the US, you may understand Georgia, if you compare a red state and a blue state, Georgia in general is a red state, but it's in the dynamic city of Atlanta, which is primarily what people may identify as a city, which is a blue state. If you know the political implication of the red versus the blue. So Georgia State University is the biggest biggest university in the state in terms of the number of students. It has over 55,000 students. However, the dynamic of student body compared to the, I would say, traditional student body in major state universities in the southeastern US, it's very different because in a big city. It's also very different because a lot of the students are working. Their ages may also be different. Many of them are older, and because they are in a city, it's all about working around the city. So this is different from a traditional college town in the US where, if there are students working, they're primarily working for the university. Here, they're working for the city. And, based on my experience, some students may say, if they had to select or choose between an exam or work, they might go for work over an exam, because they had to work, and that's what the city is all about for them as a source of income and to support their family, because traditionally they're also much older than the typical college age student. So there's a little bit difference in the dynamic, which will mirror what I'm going to be sharing with you today in terms of the argument that maybe Georgia State was actually prepared for the pandemic, and that they may have some established communicative practices that made them transition to the pandemic. And that was questionable, obviously, and we still need to actually know if that was true. But in the early months of the pandemic, this was an article from The Guardian that looked at Georgia State with a public university that actually was potentially doing it correctly. So in terms of their practices, in terms of how they adjusted, in terms of what they did as contingencies, there seemed to be positive results in the early months of the pandemic. And I'm quoting here the article, again, from Gumbel in The Guardian. This came out in September 2020, that Georgia State has become both singularly successful in terms of erasing all achievement gaps based on race and class. When COVID erupted, Georgia State was able to rely on many of the systems it already set up over the past decades to steer its undergraduates away from disaster. And it also reflected on how people communicated, the communicative processes that happened between the messaging from the university to its faculty and staff and to the students. So there was some, very positive media messaging that Georgia State was doing. Whether it's actually more for recruitment and promotion, we don't know. But again, in terms of some of the metrics and measurable outcomes, they have some data to show. Dropout and failure rates were down. And while there wasn't an actual graduation stage to cross a number of students receiving a diploma was higher than ever. So this was again in late 2020. In the first 2 weeks of remote learning, advisors were able to identify more than 8,000 students who either were not logging on or weren't performing as expected. And some needed laptops or iPads, which the university was able to provide immediately. And others were overwhelmed and needed financial or psychological guidance, and these were already available. So one thing that happened, at least in this experiential context, was that the university was prepared for it. I mentioned to you the background of the university already adjusting to the focus on elevating the kind of student body that they have. Students were working. Students were not the rich kind of students who were captured in a college town setting. And students may have financial needs. Students may already be married and have kids. But hey, the university actually was prepared to address that. They have financial advisors. So something that was working for them was the presence of all these advisors who, before the pandemic, were already actually tasked to contact the students immediately. If the students were missing classes, or the students were indicating that, oh, I might not be able to finish because I need money, they actually already have some funding available to support. Micro funds is what they call. So when the pandemic happened, it looked like they were prepared. So this is in a way a success. Again, not for every university, not for the whole United States, but this is an example where a university was actually prepared before the pandemic happened, and it's still transition. So there was that transition where things were working. However, as you can see, this was a publication from Georgia State itself, from their research magazine, where they have obviously been documenting about the 2 years of trauma. This is from 2020 to 2022. And again, I mentioned this earlier, I may sound too optimistic about it. My background is also technology and language teaching. So I am pro-technology, as what we discussed earlier in the panel in the morning. But again, I don't want to minimize that this pandemic has produced a mental health crisis all across the board and globally. And this is not to be minimized. It's major. And I want for all of us to recognize that is an issue, and that's something that we need to problematize. We actually do not know what we are experiencing at the moment and how this will affect everybody, moving forward. There have been studies on the cognitive abilities of kids born during the pandemic, from 2021 or 2020 to 2021, and how their vocabulary may be actually slowing down an acquisition of syntactic and semantic features compared to kids born before the pandemic, right? So as I move on to my actual research question in this presentation, I'm looking at academic and professional communication in higher ed in the US in terms of how we view instruction, assessment practices, and research activities. And again, I'm going to be focusing on the goal of documenting some successes, some of the challenges, and maybe, again, ask everybody, are we able to re-envision academia and professional communication in the post-COVID world? I'm saying, obviously, post-COVID, but it's a big question. Are we actually there? I mean, every time I listen to the news, it's like, it took me a long, long time to get to Hong Kong. And now that I am here, I'm scared to leave. But I thought that, if we're in post-COVID, I thought that we could travel again, but maybe not yet for many of us here in Hong Kong. So it's still an ongoing question if we are actually in the after COVID or post-COVID space. In the pre-COVID and early COVID periods, experiences in the university may mirror the following slides here. Workplace culture as changing in the US, both academic and professional environments, right? Me with training and with focus on technology and language teaching, these are my buzzwords, but hey, it became everybody's buzzwords when people were talking about synchronous and asynchronous learning. We also at Georgia State identified people who were called digital champions who attended a very, very dramatic 3-week instruction and workshop on making sure you know how to develop content, because you are now all of a sudden becoming an online instructor from being a face-to-face instructor in a math course. Hey, the next step for you is to become an online instructor, and you got to know if you're doing an asynchronous versus synchronous kind of class. You were assigned for it, and you no longer have a choice, because of all of these things that happened all at the same time, and we got to continue doing what we were doing because students needed to graduate. We also had terms like Zoom fatigue or Teams fatigue and Zoom bombing and all these things happening all at the same time. We all relied on our LMSs. We used Blackboard at Georgia State. We used iCollege. and many other things. And everybody expected all of the teachers to be experts in these things. There's one thing to be an expert or to know how to operate the machine, to know how to turn on the computer, or to know how to utilize a blackboard or mechanism and utilize your phones to access information, right? But that is it. We were not prepared to actually go deeper in terms of a theoretical model about what we were doing. So that's another big question in terms of this transition, but it seemed like everybody had to go with it, right? So I said here, Zoom as an academic and professional workplace where everything was happening within this new environment, social events, online social interaction, the use of social media at the same time, Facebook and Twitter merging into how we utilize all of these platforms, group discussion and other features all of a sudden coming up. I was not, to be honest, a Zoom user before the pandemic. I was more of a Skype user, but then all of a sudden everybody was Zooming and Teams-ing, right, in this context. This whole idea of how we continue faculty meetings this way, some of the great measurable outcomes have been attendance. In all of our Zoom meetings, everybody attended. In terms of just really counting people who were showing up and how they were doing it. Incidentally, take a look at this picture. This was actually posted in the department's Facebook page. You can see me from the bottom here because I was designated as the Masters of Ceremony in this context. We were celebrating students who were graduating, a few of them PhD students, many of them master students, but here we are toasting them. But we got information, we got called by the university because we were showing people drinking wine, and apparently that was not allowed. So that's something that we also were learning about, how we were trying to work on a face-to-face replacement. And here we are in Zoom. We're actually not allowed to show that we were holding a glass of wine in this context. Another thing that, at one point was very positive, at another point it became kind of like, oh, we're so tired of it, was what we're doing right now. Academic conferences during COVID. At the beginning, it was great. Hey, we were able to continue, right? But then at the same time, it just became, I am so tired of it. It's so hard, Some things that work, we have the presentations, and then at the same time on the side, you can have all these Twitter feeds that people are commenting and asking questions about you. So again, the merging of various social media as we work on continuing our academic activities. I had colleagues who made sure, because it's a conference, that they also went to a hotel. So the whole idea that instead of staying in your own house, go to a hotel and participate in an online conference to kind of simulate what he used to do before the pandemic happened. And again, I don't know if that was positive or not, but some people ended up thinking that, hey, I needed a different environment. As we progressed during the pandemic, we learned that, okay, we can return to campus, and we have to. Again, there's a political implication here. In the state of Georgia, they wanted, at least the politicians, they wanted everybody back as soon as possible. So there was a lockdown period, and then everybody was back. And then you have all of these measures. One thing that I critique about this was, how we came up with all of these buzzwords. They actually already existed, and they had pedagogical models already, but then people were just using them really, really carelessly, like hybrid learning or blended learning. Hey, blended learning used to mean something before the pandemic, and now they're only just referring to it as, space type, to address the difference in terms of a space. Like, others are not here, you guys are here, we call it hybrid. But hey, that's a very, very problematic setting, because that had to mean or had to have a pedagogical model, but we're not paying attention to what those were. It's just really addressing space instead of what are the work associated, what are the activities that should be expected in this type of model, right? The return to campus, again, big shock in the United States when people were wearing masks. And this is kind of like the March 2022 AAAL conference in Pittsburgh, where you have all these are my colleagues and former students. You can see them, some of them masking at one point, others are not. And they're the new normal, when you feel like, well, who are these guys who are masking and who are these guys who are not, and why? You know, why do we have this inconsistent messaging and inconsistent presentation of what we are doing, right? But this is the new normal. This bottom picture here is the current picture at Georgia State's website, where there is no more masking involved in the messaging. So that's also in the communicative norm of the messaging. It's also showing that, hey, we're no longer utilizing this. So what are the documented successes, particularly related to communication? I mentioned earlier some of the faculty meetings where there is a documented higher attendance rate when it came to Zoom option compared to the face-to-face. At Georgia State, the face-to-face attendance before the pandemic was as low as 30%. And then during the pandemic, the attendance was 89%. So that's a documented success. 2 case studies as I work on my time here. I'm going to wrap up with 2. One is with the Harvard Language Center's COVID response, and they have documented key themes that worked for them. And I'm going to highlight what Harvard identified as major success. Their telecollaboration and student engagement went really kind of very positively in this context. Also mentioned in Sal's presentation this morning. Then also the teletandem and language exchange program. They were very successful, and they found all these amazing opportunities to continue internationalization programs. And in fact, they got better during the pandemic than before. This whole teletandem and telecollaboration with students who are overseas, working with local students in Harvard. Obviously, that's questionable in terms of like, well, is it realistic for most of the US? These are Harvard kids, well privileged, well protected, well, you know, in terms of the ability to access tools and everything, they are well provided, right? And here are some of their suggestions: realistic expectations for staff, maintain open lines of communication, aim for simple and precise, impactful parcels of information, develop and push for the use of technologies. We've mentioned this already all day today, and then encourage instructors to make judicious use of synchronous video conferencing. In this notion, I draw your attention to the best philosopher of our time, the great Taylor Swift, who was recently invited as a commencement speaker at NYU. This was from, I guess, just last week. And she mentioned how, you know, all these students who are graduating completed their education during a global pandemic, and that they only they had to pass their tests, not only their academic tests, but also their COVID tests. And that's the reality of what many of our students are experiencing or have experienced. At the same time, again, I'm highlighting mental situations, mental issues that many of them have experienced over the years. I'm going to end with this one study from one of my PhD students. He graduated in 2021. And this is a research comment here. This is the time when many of our PhD students, I'm sure some of them are here right now, that you work on a project, you work on data collection, but then COVID happened and you're done with, you know, you no longer have an option. And this is what happened with Eunice. She's originally working on comparing assessment online versus face-to-face before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened, and already something happened, you know, a major change. And she had to switch. And she was one of those who became successful. Emergency remote teaching was a buzzword in 2021 because it became like how communication during COVID and assessment and teaching during COVID was characterized. And she was able to switch her study into, okay, I'm comparing face-to-face assessment versus assessment during COVID done online. There is something like a big thing missing, which was regular online assessment, and she had to drop it, and she was able to convince her committee that it was possible. So she had her teachers' practices and learners' perception as a goal. I'm gonna just breeze through here, as Hans mentioned, time for a question here. Some of the technologies that were important remote proctoring as available now during COVID. This is a quick overview of the big survey that we did with multiple participants from all over the US and a focused interview with a select group of students. Bottom line here, everybody, is that she was saying that it was doable to work on communicating the goals, finding research participants, talking with your students and participants in a survey form and in a focus group kind of interaction, that it might still happen. But some of the initial, the final findings that she has here, I'm highlighting the second one, grade inflation. I don't know, I still will have to find out, are we experiencing grade inflation in Hong Kong because of the pandemic? In the United States, it's almost a big yes for everybody across the board. Grade inflation happened. And you can see here, perceptions for teachers, allowing more time, relaxing deadlines. We're dealing with students who are already challenged so much and pushed so much. And, you know, it resulted to some grade inflation. More content for practice, more weight on participation, but they were having a difficulty defining what participation actually meant. More focus on current events instead of academic content, and then the whole focus also on digitized media. Given time, I'm going to highlight just this last, and I'm going to end here. Some of the assessment methods that teachers did before COVID and after COVID that were statistically significant here. Open book exams, you know, statistically significant. It increased during COVID. Audio video recordings, as you may expect, increased over COVID statistically. Group project decreased. So something that we were talking about earlier, Zoom is allowing us to create, small group rooms. Even Facebook is now providing us with those rooms as an opportunity. But hey, in the actual teaching, people were actually not using it. People hate it, people not using it. So you can take a look here as a significance. It's collaborative writing tests. So for those of you who are writing, it's also, in a way, with the pandemic, it's not done. Given that we thought we were prepared for it, we thought that we could allow online collaborative writing, but during the pandemic, it did not happen. Peer assessment, and I'll end here in this slide here, as also something that did not happen during COVID. So learner perceptions, they were mostly perceived online COVID assessment as helpful, relevant to the online context. Learners agreed that feedback was clear and useful online, but then they also cheated. This is a nice outcome, or, you know, mention here, a quote from one of our participants. Yes, I have cheated. He laughed. Looks like she did not notice, or maybe she was just fine with it. I think we all passed. So it's time consuming, according to them, in terms of the online assessment. Video proctoring services was cumbersome and difficult, and again, easy to cheat. And some other implications, again, I wrap it up here with it's doable. Went beyond studying teacher perspective, it also include learner perspective. And this is where we are. Again, we have a lot of data, but we need more. If this is in fact post-COVID world, then we need to continue studying, analyzing the data. We have a lot of them, and I'm sure that there are probably over 50 PhD students working on it now. And so I look forward to hearing about their results soon. And with this, I'll turn it over to Hans or to William to play maybe the next presentation. Which is from Dr. Jessica Lian, but this is recorded.